My name is Paul Lincoln, and I'm your host for Soil Matters, a podcast from the British Society of Soil Science, the professional body for soil scientists in the UK. Welcome to our second episode. Soil Matters is dedicated to bridging the gap between scientific research and real-world application. And today, we're looking at the issue of regenerative agriculture and soil health. Regenerative agriculture is an approach to farming that focuses on restoring and enhancing the health of the soil, enhancing ecosystems, and also supporting the communities that sustain them. The practice emphasizes the regeneration of topsoil, increasing biodiversity, improving the water cycle, and strengthening the health and vitality of farm soil. Key principles include minimal soil disturbance, diversifying crop rotations, and integrating livestock. By prioritizing soil health, regenerative agriculture aims to create resilient farming systems that can adapt to climate change, improve food security, and support sustainable agricultural practices. To discuss these topics today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anna Krzywoszynska, Professor Lynn Dicks, and Raquel Falcão. Anna is an environmental social scientist at the University of Oulu in Finland. Lynn is a conservation scientist at the University of Cambridge, and Raquel is completing her PhD at the Czech Technical University in Prague. We're also going to be joined a little later by the Editor-in-Chief of Soil Use and Management, Leo Condron. Our discussion is inspired by two articles published recently in the journal Soil Use and Management. The first of the articles is called Sustainable Soil Management in the United Kingdom, a survey of current practices and how they relate to the principles of regenerative agriculture. Sustainable soil management is essential to prevent agricultural soil degradation, to maintain food production and core soil-based ecosystem services. Regenerative agriculture, one approach to sustainable soil management, is rapidly gaining traction in UK farming and policy. However, what this article indicates is that it is unclear what farmers themselves consider to be sustainable soil management practices and how these might relate to the principles of regenerative agriculture. Our first guest, Anna, initiated the research and collected the data underpinning the article, and our second guest, Lynn, is leading a project on farmer-led regeneration and agricultural monitoring. Anna, welcome. Tell us, first of all, what led you to undertake this research?
Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to be here. Well, we talk a lot about sustainable soil management and we talk a lot about soil health. And these topics are relatively well researched within soil sciences. But ultimately, if we're talking about sustainable soil management, we're talking about how people treat soils. And if we're talking about soil health, we're talking about an outcome that is going to be arrived at by people's actions. And actually, we know very little about what people already do and how they assess the sustainability of what they do. So this was the underpinning motivation for this piece of work. There is very little social science and humanities research on soils, and it was a very important gap to start to bridge. Therefore, we wanted to really ask a series of quite simple questions about what farmers are already doing in relation to their soils and whether they judge these practices to constitute sustainable soil management. And how does this then link to regenerative agriculture, which I'm sure we'll talk more about in a moment.
Thank you. Now, your research shows it is unclear what farmers consider to be sustainable soil management practices. Tell us a bit about how you put the research together.
Sure. Well, I think, within scientific research, we like to have specific definitions. But in the real world, amongst people, this is not how anything works. If you ask a person what they consider to be health, human health, they will give you a range of answers. And the same thing pertains to sustainable soil management. What farmers and other land workers consider to be healthy soil really differs on the basis of their experience in different farms, different contexts, different values, different production systems. So it's not in any way surprising that we have a number of different interpretations and understandings of what sustainable management is. What one person judges to be sustainable, for example, economically, another person may not judge to be such. So I think what's important for us as scientists to know and to really take seriously is that there is such a diversity. So instead of trying to force people into narrow boxes that they will never conform to, because people never do, and why should they? We have to understand that there is this diversity there and we have to work with it. So we shouldn't assume that there is one solution or form of advice that will work for everybody. We need to know, in fact, much more about what is already done, how people judge the sustainability of these practices, and then how can we build on these existing understandings and values and concerns in our work as we're trying to improve soil health overall.
You also look at the issue of how soil management is currently promoted in agricultural knowledge and innovation services. What did you discover in that part of your research?
Well, we've looked at different advisory services and campaigns and other sources of information that farmers may have access to in order to see who is talking about sustainable soil management and in what way. Is there a centralized resource, a most trusted entity that people tend to go to, or do we have a much more fragmented landscape? And the answer is the latter. The landscape is fragmented. Sustainable soil management tends to be an add-on or an element of different forms of advice. And on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with that because, of course, soils underpin and are part of all range of ecosystem services, all range of societal action. So it's absolutely right that if we talk about water quality, there should be an element of water there. If we're talking about productivity, then there should be an element of soil there. If we're talking about ecosystem health and environmental protection, soil should be there also. So that is absolutely fine. But at the same time, it was clear from our findings that there isn't a coherent source of information on sustainable soil management. And that is an issue because as the farmers are becoming more interested in improving their soil health, they really need access to good advice, good information. A lot of projects have been funded by the European Horizon mission. There's increasing attention from NGOs. Regenerative agriculture continues to grow, and there are now dedicated regenerative agriculture advisors out there that farmers have access to. So I think we need to refresh our understanding and see what happens there. But I think overall that what's really striking from the findings and from my broader research is that what we really need is holistic advice. So it's one thing to say a tillage practice of this kind is likely to improve your soil health. That continues to be a fragmentary perspective. What we need is advice that takes a holistic approach to the farm and the farm business so that farmers can be supported and led in such a way that soil health is a result, is an outcome of the transformation of the farm overall.
I was really interested, if I can just go back to your comment on the analogies with our sense of human health. And I think it's reasonable to say that we generally do not have a consistent sense of what is good or bad health. Are you optimistic that one could come up with definitions of soil health that are maybe more focused, narrower, more easy to debate and discuss than the ones that we impose on ourselves?
I don't think that we need a clear definition from the perspective of societal change towards soil health. That is not where our energy should be going, because it's not a clear understanding of what health constitutes that will bring the change about. What will bring the change about is enabling the actors who can do something, such as farmers, to take steps towards a goal. And that goal can be quite vague. The goal can be quite inspirational and aspirational. I think that's more important than it being strictly defined according to scientific criteria. Because also, of course, our scientific understanding of what constitutes soil health will continue to change. It is always a moving target. So I think the most important thing is that we are moving towards the target together, and we are doing the scientific work that can bring the larger community of soil workers with us towards this goal.
Brilliant. Okay, well, on the moment of inspirational and aspirational, that's an excellent comment. Let's move on. If I could now have a word with Lynn. And the question I wanted to ask you, Lynn, first of all, sustainable soil management. What is your definition of this?
So having been listening to Anna, this is going to be my definition, and someone else's definition could be quite different. So for me, soil is being sustainably managed if it's not degrading over time, right? If it's either maintaining its functions or it's building its functions, and the functions there are, the life that lives in it, the way in which it cycles nutrients, the organic matter that it holds, the way that it handles water infiltrates through it, water is held by the soil. All of those important soil functions are in a sustainably managed soil, not degrading over time. And the soil itself isn't disappearing over time, right? So we have this concept of soil lifespan. And that's one way to measure that is like how many years does it take to lose 30 centimetres of topsoil from this soil, given the processes going on in this place? And that could be anything from 200 to 10,000 years. And a sustainably managed soil is not losing topsoil. So it has a very, very long lifespan ahead of it.
So a question which may well be an obvious one is, why is sustainable soil management important?
It's an excellent question, and it's really important to be able to articulate an answer to that, right? Sustainable soil management, or having soils that are not degrading, is important because soil is the basis of much of our food chain as people. It's where we grow much of our food. Without soil, there are ways to produce food. There's obviously seafood, which is harvested from wild-caught animals in the sea. That doesn't rely on soil. And there are other sources of food that you can manufacture in different ways. But I don't know the percentage myself, but I'd imagine a very, very big chunk of all our food comes from food from products that are grown in the soil. Perhaps Anna knows the percentage. I don't know. And so if you're looking at, there was a recent study which assessed this soil lifespan for arable soils across the world. And in conventionally managed arable soils, which are probably not sustainably managed, 1/3 of those have a lifespan of less than 200 years. That means 200 years from now, there'll be 1/3 of the places where we're currently growing our arable crops won't have sufficient topsoil to grow arable crops in the way that we do now. And this is why it's important. There's a lot of people on Earth and we need to grow a lot of food.
And I find that comment really quite astonishing. So my next question is regenerative agriculture. It's an approach to sustainable soil management, which is clearly rapidly gaining traction in the UK and far wider in terms of UK farming and policy. Now, why do you think this awareness is happening now?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. And one of them is, as I was just saying, I think farmers particularly and also policymakers have woken up to the fact that soil is a really important resource. We need to look after it. It's neither renewable, it's sort of renewable, but it's also non-renewable. But we need to care for it. And if it disappears, we'll be really stuck. So it's something that we can lose. And looking at the calculated rates of loss across the world, then this is something we need to do something about. That's one thing. Another thing is that the way that agriculture developed during the 20th century was to have a system that was very heavily dependent on chemical inputs to increase yields and be very intensive in its food production. And that was fantastically successful in terms of increasing food production for much of the second half of the 20th century. But it's actually stopped continuing to be successful. Yields are no longer increasing. And in fact, farmers have realised, and this is the narrative you hear from many regenerative farmers, they've noticed that they're putting on all these very expensive, increasingly expensive chemicals, and it's not actually helping them. They're not increasing yields. In fact, their yields are static or declining. Or certainly for some of the main combinable crops, the yields are fairly static now. They're not increasing anymore. And what we are doing with that very intensive chemical heavy system is degrading soils. We're putting increasing amounts of fungicides on to stop fungal diseases. We've got very unresilient cropping systems. And I think people have noticed that and started thinking there must be another way. This system isn't actually working anymore. And then the third thing that's happening is climate change. Climate change is here. Climate change is really starting to bite in terms of its effect on food systems. Now, we have much less predictable weather patterns here. We have these intense droughts. We have intense rainfall. And in many parts of the world, it's a much more bleak outlook than it is here in the UK. I think people have started to realise that we've got to do something about that. First of all, we have to mitigate. We've got to reduce the emissions that are associated with agriculture, which are substantial, and a lot of them are from nitrous oxide emissions, which is directly associated with the use of synthetic fertilizers. And we also have to adapt to climate change. We need to build an agricultural system that is not going to suffer so much as the climate changes. And how do you do that? Well, one of the ways is to diversify the stuff you're growing and to look after your soils better so that you hold water better. And regenerative agriculture presents itself as a solution to all three of those things.
Great. And now tell us a bit about the approach that you took when you were doing your research.
We began with a survey that Anna put together of a national survey of 297 farmers responded in the end, asking them about the state of their soil and what soil management practices they used. And some of the findings are very interesting, but we were looking at it through the lens of regenerative agriculture. What can we learn from this about how farmers currently in the UK are practicing or looking after their soils? And we found a few interesting things from the results of the survey. A few things I'd pick out. One of the most interesting figures in the paper, if anyone's listening is going to read the paper, I'd just direct you to figure 2. And this is about how farmers perceive the state of their own soils and how they perceive the state of other soils elsewhere in the UK or elsewhere in the world. It's fascinating. So in general, the summary of this is that farmers in this sample of 297 perceived that their own soils were either lightly degraded or not degraded. Other soils in the UK were degraded or heavily degraded, and soils elsewhere in the world were degraded or heavily degraded even more. So basically, my soil's fine, other people's not so good, which is kind of interesting because that can't actually be true. So that's one of the findings. And then the other important findings here, we give them these 14 sustainable soil management practices, and we ask them, are you aware of this and are you implementing it yourself? One important thing to say is that most of the practices, there's quite a high level of awareness. Sort of over 50% for most of them of the farmers had heard of this thing. And this is things like no tillage, minimum tillage, ploughing with the along the slope, or using herbal lays. And there's a whole list of different things. But also, what was interesting is that between 11 and 52% for each practice of the farmers in the arable farmers in this survey were implementing these. So quite a high level of implementation already, which we've also found in previous surveys. Quite a lot of these individual practices, a good proportion, 30, 40 or 50% of UK farmers are already doing this. But what that doesn't mean is that they're all doing, or this percentage of farmers are doing regenerative agriculture. And this is where it becomes more interesting. So there's a big difference between a regenerative approach where you're managing a whole farm system with all of the different methods and the principles, the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture in order to manage your soil. So that includes keeping the soil covered and minimizing disturbance, and also diversifying your cropping systems and your environments, and integrating livestock, keeping the roots alive all the time. These are the 5 principles. There are many different practices you would do to put those into practice in different contexts, but you have to do them all together to do the full kind of regenerative agriculture. And what we see is that although the farmers are implementing some of the practices, they're not combining them together necessarily into something that looks like regenerative agriculture based on these 5 principles.
You really touched on this, but what would you like the impact of your research to be on everyday practice?
Looking at the results of the survey as a whole, what we find is what we've gone on to find in more recent research is that each farm has what we would call a fingerprint. Every farm is unique. No farms are doing exactly the same set of practices. And now we're looking at it going back through 5 years of historical practices as well. And even more so, every single farm is different from every other farm. None of the farms are doing none of the regenerative practices, and none of them are doing all of them. So they're on this kind of gradient. But in our survey published in Soil Use and Management, 92% of the arable and mixed farmers in this survey said, I am doing sustainable soil management. So they all said they were doing it. Or almost all of them. All but 8% of them said they were doing it. But what they were actually doing was quite a wide spectrum of different sets of practices along this spectrum of regenerativeness, you might call it. And so because of that, and this is where we're continuing with this research on regenerative agriculture, there is a huge risk of greenwashing here. It's very easy for a farmer to say, I'm regenerative because I do minimum tillage on 1 field in 3 every 5 years. And that's not regenerative at all. So there's a risk.
Really interesting thought is clearly you've approached this group of farmers as part of your research, but if you wanted them to change their practice on a routine basis, who would be responsible for helping them to do this?
Regenerative agriculture, as it is at the moment, is a farmer-led movement, and farmers are doing it themselves. there are these forerunner farmers who are just going ahead and doing it and telling everybody else at the tops of their voices how fantastic it is. And that's a really important part of the process of social change. But it's also important to note that there is a need for financial support for farmers generally in this country and many other countries. And there is a need for an incentive structure that helps farmers to make that transition, because it does look like when you move from a very conventional chemical heavy system to a more regenerative system, there's a transition period where you might in the end lose some income, you might lose some profit, you might have some trouble with pests, and that can be between 5 and 10 years long. So there is a need for support through the transition. And one thing I have not measured scientifically but generally observe in my work in this area is that those farmers that are the pioneers who are moving to regenerative systems, they tend to be wealthier farmers. They're more able to take risks because they have other income streams or they have a lot of asset. And so they're in a position, they're not quite on the line of depending entirely on that business. So there is some need for support, financial support. And where should that come from? It can come from government. It can come from supply chains if they can be arranged properly to recognise regenerative agriculture. It can come from certification potentially.
And what do you see as the single biggest threat to regenerative agriculture being adopted as widely as you would like it to be?
I think that there are two main barriers here. One is, as I was just saying, the financial risk during the transition. You have to be prepared to take a risk. And so the other source of support there can be through insurance companies and financial services. You can have a support for farmers who are making this transition. So financial risk is one of the threats. And the other threat I see is the lack of really good quality independent advice on how to do this. The way that farming works in this country is that the risk is taken by agronomic advisors who are supposedly independent of farms. They take the risk. They give the advice. If it doesn't work out, they take the financial hit, not the farmer. And so to get to a system where those agricultural advisors are prepared to take the risk and give advice when the system they're advising on is regenerative and not something that they've previously been trained on, it's quite a big step from here, I would say.
That is so interesting, because my final question for the moment was to ask you a bit about the financial implications of your research. What should we be thinking about there?
So from a farm business perspective, the financial implications should be, and I think the farmers who are doing it will argue that this is the case, the farms should be more profitable. Farmers will tell you, my bottom line is much better. And the reason why it's expected to be more profitable, and is according to the farmers who are doing it well, is that you spend less money on inputs. You buy less synthetic fertilizer, you put a lot less insecticides in. And so you spend less, but you get equivalent yields, or some farmers will tell you higher. I haven't seen data on that, but equivalent or very slightly lower. But the balance is that it costs you less, and so you make more profit. And there is some really good evidence in the literature that these systems are more profitable from maize farms in the United States. So from a farm business perspective, the financial implications are this will secure the economic resilience of the farming sector into the future because it makes individual farms more profitable.
Lynn, thank you very much for that comment. Now, Anna, I think you wanted to make a comment as well.
Thank you, Paul. I wanted to come back to this question of greenwashing and of what regenerative agriculture really is. Lynn said something extremely important. Regenerative agriculture is a farmers' movement. It came from the farmer community, and it is led by the farmer community. And at the moment, scientists are interested. We are following, we are studying. We should continue to follow, and we should continue to study, and we should continue to enable. But we should not try to lead. That is my very, very strong suggestion. This is a farmers' movement that is motivated, in fact, by farmers finding themselves facing a brick wall. I have done a number of interviews in this field with farmers as well as with farmer advisors, and we could call them transition managers. People whose job it is to support the farmers as they are transitioning into the regenerative agriculture system. And the story that I hear over and over again is of people turning to regenerative agriculture out of desperation, out of not being able to continue within the current agro-food model. So this desire to change the farming system in such a way that sustainability and financial sustainability go together, more profitable farms that can be sustained into the future, is absolutely at the core of this. And the concerns about greenwashing, when I'm talking to people within the regenerative agriculture space, these concerns are actually being raised in relation to big companies and big players who are now branding their products or their advisory services as regenerative agriculture. So it is here that the regenerative agriculture farming community is asking us, scientists, to step in to help them to decide, okay, what kind of barriers, limits, indicators can we set in place to make sure that we are going in the right direction, that we're not excluding our members, that more people can participate in this very important transitional movement, but that we don't lose in terms of this movement being taken over by the usual players who have been feeding chemicals into the system for ages. So I think it's another call for the scientific community to really partner up with the farming community and enable them with our work.
Brilliant, thank you. We're now going to talk about a second paper, which is called Farmers' Perception of Soil Health, the use of quality data and its implication for farm management. Preventing and reversing soil degradation is essential to maintaining the ecosystem services provided by soils and guaranteeing food security. This paper argues that in addition to the scientific community, it's also very important to engage many stakeholders to assess and to understand the degree of soil degradation and also the mitigation strategies that are needed to have an impact and to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy. So I'm delighted now to welcome Raquel and ask you some questions about the work that you did on this particular paper. And my first question, a good starting question, I hope, is what prompted you to undertake this research?
Hi, Paul. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor, and particularly to be sharing the time here with these two amazing scientists. I came from Brazil, originally from Brazil, and I came to Prague to do this PhD. It's a Horizon 2020 project, and it focuses on soil health, and also it focuses on stakeholder engagement, and it's a European-China project. The topic really appealed to me right away because I was very excited to join a research that not only quantifies and assesses the degree of degradation, but it also does the step forward to propose mitigation strategies. And the research that I'm talking about now, the paper that we published, was also done on a survey that we conducted with the participating countries. I have to confirm, but 6 participating countries and different institutions involved in this project. And we managed to get more than 450 responses, which was a pretty interesting number for this kind of work. And we wanted to get an understanding of how farmers evaluate the degree of soil health on their field and how they assess their knowledge of soil health and also their willingness to assess soil quality in their field, given simple and inexpensive tools were provided, because that would be one of the next steps and goals within our project is to develop decision support tools to help farmers make decisions on management.
So what's interesting is that your work goes beyond the farming community that we've been talking about so far today. Tell us a bit about some of the non-farmers that you were keen to engage with.
In particular for me, and I think that might be the case for a lot of PhD candidates, most of our work ends up being with cooperation within other scientists and other researchers. I think that might be due to the time length of our work. So I feel like I unfortunately did not have the chance to cooperate as much with players beyond the farming and academic community. I think this is a gap that you've mentioned at the very beginning of your introduction to the podcast, that there is this gap between science and the general public or practical implications. I think that there is a growing awareness around this gap and the need to address it, but I think there's still a long way to go.
Okay. And tell us about the implications of your research for soil conservation generally.
I hope that the main implications or the main contributions of our work will be really this decision support tools that we're developing now. We did that in cooperation with an app developing company, and the idea is that it will help farmers to assess the current state of their soil, and with some frequency, as much as they are willing to or are able to do, to revisit these parameters that they'll be able to measure with the tool. So I hope that this first gives a more concrete impression of the state of the soil on their farms, and that with that they be able to understand which way they should go to either enhance soil quality or keep it as it is if the result of the measurements or the analysis turns to be that your soil condition is good, so you can keep it at that.
We've talked about collaborative networks. What kind of collaborative network do you think need to be created?
I think the different stakeholders, the ones that come to my mind immediately are farmers, who are the ultimate executors of any regenerative strategy to be taken. I think the research, also academia, has to be involved, in the public sector, governments, because they are also an important player in giving out incentive to farmers. I think that we need to have more applied research on the needs of farmers.
And what do you think is the consequence of failure to adopt technologies that will reverse the degradation of this is something that we've already touched on, but what do you think is the consequence of failure to reverse the degradation of agricultural soils?
I think ultimately, worst case scenario is that we'll fail to feed people. And I think this is a tricky or maybe a cruel aspect of climate change, is that the current areas where we're currently growing will be affected, but on the other hand, areas that are currently unfit for agriculture, let's say in the Arctic circle, areas that are too cold maybe for growing crops, will become adequate for agriculture. And I've seen that there's already a growing interest in these areas, so we can see the agricultural frontier advancing to areas that were not fit for agriculture before. We also know that the rate of degradation of soils, as it's already been mentioned, the rate of degradation is a lot higher and a lot superior than that of the regeneration of soils. And I think it's also important that awareness is raised, because it's too easy to think that we don't have an issue here because we import our crops from other countries. But there have also been a lot of research done showing that the food that Europe or North America import come from regions that are over depleting their water resources. So I think it's a crisis in the making, and I think the fact that the awareness is now raising, it's already been said, is that we're clearly reaching a tipping point, and best time to act was sometime in the past, but now it's the second best time to act.
My last question to you is, what most surprised you about the outcome of your research?
I think what most surprised me is that in our questionnaire, we saw that farmers are very willing to use tools if they're provided the tools, and they're open to cooperation. We've seen other researchers showing that farmers are tired of scientists. This was a catchy title of a paper that came out some years ago. And from what we heard is that they're not. They're still open. So I think it's up to scientists and academia to be smart and approach them the right way.
Just a couple of extra questions. If I can start with you, Anna, what research would you like to do next?
I have been working on this intersection of social sciences and natural sciences of soil for a while. And what I have been really worried by is that we are very often still operating with what is known as the knowledge deficit model. This pertains not only to soil science, but to environmental science and many other areas more generally. The knowledge deficit model says people don't know, and if only they knew, they would act. And this is wrong. And we have studies that show that this is wrong. The knowledge deficit model doesn't work. Just knowing that something is broken doesn't help us fix it. So my growing area of research is how do we construct scientific knowledge processes? How do we change how we make science? How do we change how we do research in such a way that we can participate in the fixing? Rather than just saying that things are broken, how do we facilitate the fixing? And please ask Lynn about the project under the umbrella of H3, because it's such a wonderful example of what happens when a farming community and a scientific community get together to try to fix things. And they start from having a conversation about what is broken and what doesn't work in this specific place for this specific set of people in these specific ecological, social, economic conditions. And then what is needed specifically from science to overcome the barriers, the problems, to open up new avenues of action. And I think this is the way that we need to be going. So the regenerative agriculture movement is very hungry for that kind of collaboration. I have another paper in soil use and management from some years back, which I encourage you all to read, which makes that very same argument on the basis of conversations with farmers practicing sustainable soil use and soil management. So really, there is a great opportunity for science and an increasing push for science to do this kind of work. And we should capture it. It's really a wonderful time.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into me then asking Lynn, what do you want to do next?
So what I'm working on at the moment is the project that this paper we were talking about was at the beginning of, the H3 project, Healthy Soil, Healthy Food, Healthy People, was a co-designed experiment with a group of farmers. So as Anna was describing, a kind of participatory approach to research where we both design the research and do the research in partnership with farmers. And that the results of that are emerging and will probably be coming out in publications next year. But what we're now thinking about is how to scale it up. So we've done that in 2 landscapes with a relatively limited number of farms, and we did some very detailed monitoring of the outcomes of the transition to regenerative agriculture. We work with farmers that are not regenerative, farmers that are regenerative, and farmers that are making a transition from non to regenerative during the course of the project. So then we're measuring all these outcomes. We're measuring the quality of the soil. We're measuring how the large water stable aggregates hold carbon in the soil. And we're measuring the biodiversity, so the response of birds and the response of insects and the economics of that change. But it's context dependent. It's different places. So what we're doing now is scaling that. We're trying to get funding at the moment to scale it to a much larger number of farms across the country, working in partnership with both farmers and also supply chain retailers to try and find ways to measure the outcomes that are scalable. So it's a very exciting time to work in biodiversity research, which is my main focus, because there are these emerging technologies, acoustic monitoring, image recognition, remote sensing, which enable you to measure biodiversity. But those technologies allow us to scale the monitoring and to enable farmers to themselves be in charge of the monitoring for things like biodiversity outcomes. And we're looking more carefully now at climate change outcomes. So the kind of how well is this mitigating climate change and reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, actually measuring those outcomes. The technology to scale that at low cost isn't really validated yet, but there's a lot of people working on it. So we're also pushing at that boundary. So we want to be able to scale up the monitoring and the final thing to say about the direction we're going is I work in conservation science, and conservation science has woken up in the last 5 years to the methods that have been developed in econometrics, which is a branch of economics, to understand the causal effects of different changes in real complex settings, like real world situations where nothing is simple and everything's complex and different. There are loads of statistical methods to take account of confounding variables and try and work out whether something actually works in this real world setting. Conservation scientists are now using those methods. Hardly anyone in agricultural sustainability is using them. So we're also pushing on that. So we want to look at the effectiveness of regenerative agriculture using the best methods of causal inference to properly design a study that will really get to that and allow us to be confident when we say this effect was an outcome from regenerative agriculture.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Raquel, let me ask you again the same question. What would you like to do next?
I think this is the second question, like the top questions you should not ask a PhD candidate. First is when when do you finish? And then what is it that you're doing next? So I'm coming to the end of my PhD journey, and it's quite of a bittersweet journey, I have to say, because I feel like the moment that I get confident with my potential and the value of my contribution to the debate is the time to wrap things up and finish. So I'm not sure. I think what I would like is to have a more of a hands-on experience, maybe work with a study case or work together with a farmer that is willing to cooperate. I agree with what's been said before about the need for a holistic approach. I think this is an aspect of science and research that is hard to apply to agriculture, is that we want to have general statements and general conclusions. But oftentimes, in the case for agricultural systems, they are very context specific. We had this one quote that I thought was brilliant from one of the farmers in our survey, where he said, and I quote, "With all due respect, there are so many different and contrasting recommendations that it is hard for me to know what is best in my particular case." So that really caught my eye 4 years ago when we did it. I would really like to contribute to answering these questions.
Well, thank you. I think that was a hugely inspiring way to conclude our discussion. Anna, Lynn, Raquel, huge thanks for a really, really fascinating discussion. If you'd like to follow up their research and indeed to read the papers on which our discussion has been based, please go to the new podcast page on the BSS website and you'll find a series of links. And to finish today, I'd like to have a chat with Leo Condron, Editor-in-Chief of Soil Use and Management. Leo, welcome. This is SUM's 40th anniversary year, and we've already been discussing a range of topics that have been at the heart of soil use and management. Remind me of your mission.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. I took over as the editor just 4 months ago, and one of the tasks that we've done is to actually revise the mission statement, right? It's and we're still going through the final draft of it, but I think the best way to do it is just to give you the mission. The journal is pretty much as goes on the title. It's about soil use and management, but obviously it's focused on soils, right? But it also includes within the wider context of agricultural science, environmental science, and importantly, policy studies that relate to those factors. We're interested in obviously significant new novel information or insight on the influence of natural and anthropogenic processes on the function, productivity, health, and sustainability of managed soil systems. And a very important part of that is the role of what we call soil stewardship, which is a very important concept, I think, in addressing global issues as well, because there are impacts here beyond what you might call the farm gate or whatever, in terms of global issues such as the mitigation of and adaptation to ongoing climate change, environmental quality, food security, and specifically progress towards achievement of specific UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think that pretty much sums up where we're going. But the emphasis is really on the management of soil and how we manage the soil. There is a component there of land use and land use change, but land use and management are two compatible components.
And let me ask you what may be an obvious question, but why is soil stewardship so important?
I mean, it's obviously the foundation of our terrestrial food systems. The sustainable management of those resources is absolutely crucial, because any degradation or loss of any soil is very hard. Well, loss of soil is irreversible, but any reduction in the capacity of a soil to function has a very, very important component on not only food supply and food security, but also the economic value. Farming is a business, and there's a lot of the world where farming is subsistence, but in many parts of the world, farming is a business, so that there has to be an economic imperative in there as well. But it's getting that balance between economic, environmental, social, and those sorts of values that's very, very important. And that's where the policy thing comes in as well.
And What would you say are the key trends this year?
I would say that the continuing trends is there's a lot of work coming in on soil organic matter, because soil organic matter is key to soil management, because it directs so many of the chemical, the biological, the physical properties of soil, which rounds round to things like soil health, which you've been talking about. It's a theme, it just keeps coming through. The other thing is amendment of soil in terms of not only fertilizer materials, but also things like biochar, charcoal. And specifically, I wouldn't identify it as any trends. It's basically tracking along that way, because we don't tend to deal with direct fertilizer work. That's more for other journals, although there are aspects that we cover.
So in terms of the way you'll be putting together your program over the next year, obviously you've got an incredible choice, but it's very useful for potential writers to know what the structure is. So in terms of the journal's key themes, could you outline where you are for the next 2 or 3 issues?
There's a number of ways that we can do this, and different journals do it different ways. One is through what we call special issues or special collections, which are focused on particular topics. And for example, we've got 2 at the moment. As I say, I'm relatively new to the job, so it's something we're going to develop. But there's 2. One is on the integration of nature-based solutions into soil and land management decisions. And the other one is specifically on conservation tillage for managing degraded soils in China. So those ones are wrapping up. And so I'm right in the middle of actually developing a strategy and mechanisms for actually developing new topics that we want to pursue. We've got to also be cognizant of what other journals are doing, because we obviously don't want to be copying or duplicating what other people are doing. But we've got to be within our mission. It's very important. So there is a number of conversations going on at the moment about that. Another way of doing it is essentially commissioning keynote review articles or commentary articles. And we actually have that mechanism in place in soil use and management. And we're just discussing how we advance that at the moment. And that's a situation where we say we can see a gap there in terms of we want to highlight a particular aspect.
And what should people do if they've got an idea for publication?
They should just email me. It's simple. My email's on the SUM website. Yeah, and just today, this evening, sorry, I had an inquiry for example, for a review. And also it was a suggestion about potentially a special issue. Alternatively, they can contact the journal, but the simplest way is to contact me and start a conversation.
Brilliant. That is really helpful. So Leo, thank you. And thanks for joining us today on Soil Matters. Subscribe on Spotify, Acast and Apple Podcasts to make sure that you hear the next episode as soon as it is uploaded. To learn more about our journals, to become a member, or discover more about the British Society of Soil Science, visit our website at www.soils.org.uk. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Professor Jack Hannam, and I'm a soil scientist, and I'm past president of the British Society of Soil Science. Did you know the health of our soil affects everything? Our food, our climate, our health, and our future. Formed in 1947, the British Society of Soil Science is a professional membership body dedicated to protecting, improving, and discovering new knowledge about the foundation of our planet, soil. From developing cutting-edge research, engaging with international and domestic governments through science-led policy and advocacy, to publishing in leading sector journals, and accessing extensive educational resources, our members are given the tools to be at the forefront of shaping a sustainable future. Our members are central to making a real impact and facilitating lasting change. Through access to our extensive networks, they could connect with experts and drive the conversation on soil health worldwide. Join a passionate community committed to tackling the future generational climate, biodiversity and food security challenges. Don't wait, get involved today, because soil is where it all begins. and soil matters now more than ever. Find out more at soils.org.uk.